The steel was cold enough to feel through the work gloves. Not cold like weather, cold like the inside of something that had been patient for a very long time. Admiral Corin Dess remembered that detail specifically. He had visited the quiet tier only once, near the end, when there was no longer any reason to keep him away. The worker who showed him around had not apologized for the temperature. He had simply explained that the ventilation was calibrated for equipment, not people. The equipment did not complain. That was the number that mattered, not the casualty count. Not the fleet count. 130. Everything that happened, every decision made in that council chamber, every name read aloud on that broadcast, every ship that rolled out into the dark without a flag, was a consequence of 130 years. If you understood the years, you understood the rest. Humanity had been a member of the galactic conclave for all of them. Junior member. Patient member, the kind of member who holds the door and says thank you and signs every paper placed in front of them without reading the footnotes. Or so the conclave believed. Dess had given his press address. He had answered what he could. Now, because someone had to say this plainly and for the record, he was saying it. He ran his thumb along the inside of his left wrist, where the shrapnel scar curved, and he began. What you need to understand first, before Pelivar, before the Ardent Reserve, before any of it, is what it felt like to be managed. The conclave was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that stops being impressive and becomes atmospheric, like humidity. The Dravathi had been filing procedural motions for 6,000 years. The Senari had observed 4 separate extinction events, and cataloged each one in meticulous detail. By the time humanity made first contact, the table had been set for so long that the chairs had grooves worn into the floor. Humans arrived and were given a seat. The seat was slightly shorter than the others. No one mentioned this. It was simply how the seats had always been arranged. For 130 years, the Terran Accord played the part assigned to it, signed the disarmament protocols, attended the cultural exchange summits, submitted the quarterly reports on colony development, economic output, scientific contribution. Earth's diplomats learned to pause before speaking because the older species read fast speech as aggression. They learned to lower their eyes in certain council configuration because direct sustained eye contact registered as a dominance display to 3 of the 7 voting blocks. They learned, in short, to make themselves smaller in every room they entered, and they were very, very good at it. The part that still keeps me up at night, that comes later. Stay close. 18 years before that Tuesday in the tribunal hall, a woman named Marin Sali stood on the landing platform of a colony called Pelivar and watched a cargo shuttle descend through a sky the color of pale jade. Pelivar orbited a star slightly cooler than Sol. The light was different, softer, with less yellow in it, and in the mornings, when the sun came through the long curtains, which was what the colonists called the particular formation of high-altitude cirrus that appeared at dawn, everything looked like it was being seen through old glass. Sally's had been here 11 years. She had stopped noticing the light, which meant she had started to belong. 2.1 million people lived on Pelivar. The colony had been growing for 12 years. Its 3rd generation was being born here, children who had never seen Earth except in photographs. They played on grass that was not quite the right shade of green and chased 6-limbed creatures the colonists had named amblers, which were approximately the size of large dogs and had a constitutional inability to resist anything edible left unattended. At the colony's annual civic ceremony the previous spring, an ambler had wandered onto the stage during the governor's address, climbed the 3 steps to the podium, and stood there for 4 minutes while the crowd waited. Someone had filmed it. The video had 40 million views on Earth. Sally's had watched it 17 times. She kept it on her personal drive, in a folder she did not organize. It was the kind of thing you kept because it was proof a place was real. The colony had 3 patrol vessels stationed above it. Locals called them the Uncles. 2 of them predated Pelivar's founding. The 3rd was marginally newer. Their weapons were calibrated for riot suppression and debris deflection. Their shields were rated for micrometeorite impacts. They were there because the Conclave's membership charter required a visible defense presence near settled worlds, and because Pelivar's administrators had submitted the correct forms requesting updated vessels and been told the request was under review. That had been 7 years ago. Captain Roan Atta commanded the flotilla. He was 54 years old, built like a man who had never quite stopped carrying things, with a jaw that looked like it had been installed with structural integrity in mind. He trained his crew for engagements that the Conclave had formally and in writing told him would never happen. He called it maintenance of readiness. His crew had other names for it, none of which they used within his earshot. They did the drills anyway. In Atta's private assessment logs, which Des had read later, the ones marked personal not for record, there was a line that appeared once in every entry, sometimes in the middle of a paragraph, sometimes at the end as if he had remembered something and added it as an afterthought. The line was, 3 ships is not enough. He never explained what it was not enough for. He did not need to. Governor Solis had a log of her own. It was handwritten, which was unusual enough in the 34th century that her aide had once asked about it, and she had said that she found paper harder to stamp no action indicated on. The log was 140 pages. It contained, in Solis's precise infrastructure engineer handwriting, a record of every security assessment she had ever filed with the Conclave and every response she had received. The assessments described what she saw: patrol flight patterns that drifted closer to Pelivar's orbit each month, ships that did not transmit identifying codes, a species called the Cavith, newly admitted to the Conclave 14 months prior, whose vessels had begun conducting what they termed training exercises in Pelivar's outer system. The responses described what the Conclave preferred to believe, that the Cavith were a peaceful people who had made significant institutional progress, that proximity flights were standard navigation, that Dr. Isa Keth's research on Cavith religious texts, which Solis had attached to 3 separate assessments, had not been reviewed because the translation methodology required peer validation by Cavith scholars. Thank you for your continued diligence. Your report has been received and reviewed. No action indicated at this time. Solis read the log on bad nights. It was, she had told her deputy once, the most thorough record of being ignored she had ever compiled. Dr. Isa Keth had spent 9 years on the Cavith question. She was a xenobiologist by training and a cultural analyst by necessity, a small woman with a habit of finishing other people's sentences accurately and an institutional tendency to be correct slightly before anyone wanted her to be. She had read every Cavith text she could access. She had studied the relief carvings in their oldest temples. She had tracked the flight patterns, correlated them with Cavith liturgical calendars, and produced a report that included a translated passage from a conquest liturgy describing species with smooth skin as unfinished offerings, set aside for later by a merciful hand. The Conclave's Cultural Affairs Division had returned the report with a note explaining that translations of sacred texts required methodology review by members of the source community, and that the Cavith had not yet established a recognized scholarly committee for this purpose, and that they looked forward to Dr. Keth's revised submission once appropriate channels were in place. Dr. Keth had filed the note. She had also, very quietly, updated her report and submitted it again with a different methodology section. The response was identical. She filed that one too. She kept working. There is something worth saying about the Cavith before what happened, because it matters to understand what they were, not just what they did. They were 7 feet tall on average. Their spines and jaw ridges carried chitinous plating that shifted from pale amber in low light to dark copper in direct sun, so that a crowd of them moving together looked, at a distance, like something burning. Their hands had 4 fingers with rigid claw tips that clicked softly when they relaxed, a sound their own neurological literature described as analogous to a sigh. Their breath carried sulfur compounds in trace amounts, not enough to harm, enough to register. In full sunlight, with 100 of them standing still, you could smell them before you could count them. Sovereign Primus Urath Keln had 38 kill marks scarred into his shoulders. In Cavith theology, the marks were liturgical. They indicated personal participation in conquest, which their religion held to be the highest form of devotion. Kelm was not unusual in this. He was simply successful. They had been at war with someone for most of their documented history. When they joined the Conclave, they were given the full membership ceremony, the flags, the seat at the long table, the speeches about institutional progress and the responsibilities of civilization. They had sat through it all. Des, who had watched the recording several times afterward, thought they looked like people who had been told to act interested and had decided that was a reasonable request. 14 months into their membership, their ships began appearing near Pelivar. The proximity reports started arriving at the Conclave's traffic management office in the 4th month of Cavith membership. Each one documented a Cavith vessel operating within Pelivar's outer system, within the navigational zone that required advanced notification under Membership Charter Article 14, subsection 9. The vessels filed no notification. Pelivar's sensors tagged them and generated automatic reports. The reports went up the chain. Each one came back stamped, "No action," indicated within 6 hours of receipt. The standard review window for proximity violation was 72 hours, 22 reports, 22 stamps. Each one cleared in a fraction of the time the process was designed to require. Des had gone back and checked the timestamps afterward. The fastest clearance was 4 hours and 11 minutes. The slowest was 5 hours and 53 minutes. Every single one fell inside a 6-hour window that no Conclave Traffic Review Board had ever operated within before in the entire documented history of the office. Someone had been clearing the approach. The morning it happened was an ordinary morning. That detail matters, and Des wanted it on record, because there is a particular cruelty to ordinary mornings that precede catastrophe, the way they don't announce themselves, the way they smell the same and feel the same and give you no indication that this is the last one of its kind. Sally's was awake at 600. She made tea, the same tea she made every morning, a blend her mother had sent from Earth, slightly too floral for the climate, and she stood at her window and watched the light change through the long curtain. The console on her desk showed standard reading. The 3 uncles were in their standard orbits. The Cavith vessels that had been logging proximity appearances for 4 months were not currently visible on sensor. She almost went back to sleep. She made a note in her log instead. Quiet morning. No activity. 3rd week running. She dated it and set down her tea and began reviewing the morning's administrative queue. Pelivar's sensors tagged the first Cavith vessel 11 seconds before the Conclave relay did. They came out of transit at 7:43 local time. 94 vessels. The number climbed as Pelivar's sensor array resolved the full picture, the way you blink at something bright, and it takes a moment for your eyes to tell you what you're actually looking at. The initial count was 41, then 63, then 94, which was where it stopped, which was already more than the 3 uncles could have managed if the uncles had been 10 times the ships they were. Ada had 3 vessels and 7 minutes to decide what to do with the math. He had already decided. Anyone who knew Roan Ada had already known he would decide this way. His crew knew. They did the drills. They did not complain in front of him, and when the order came, they were already moving. His comms officer that morning was a 26-year-old named Fenn who had been scheduled to rotate home in 19 days. She had a list, a handwritten list, which apparently ran in certain circles, of 17 restaurants in Lisbon she intended to visit in sequence. She had researched them across 6 months of downtime. The list was specific, which table she would request at each one, what she intended to order, who she planned to bring. She was at her station when the order came. She carried out her duties correctly. She did not hesitate. Ada took his 3 ships up. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. The uncles were not built to survive 20 minutes against 94 Cavith warships, and they did not survive 20 minutes, but they were built by people who trained for things they were told would never happen, and in the time they had they did what they could. 2 Cavith frigates were destroyed. 1 Cavith destroyer sustained damage sufficient to remove it from the engagement. The Cavith fleet did not slow down. Ada's final transmission was a system status report. It was filed using standard format, transmitted to the correct relay address, timestamped and coded correctly, the same as every status report he had filed in 23 years of service. It was incomplete because his ship was burning when he filed it. He marked it to be continued by surviving personnel. There were none. The transmission reached the Conclave relay station 40 seconds before the relay lost contact with Pelivar's surface network entirely. Down on the surface, Marin Salis had already opened every broadcast channel. She was not making a speech. She had decided, at some point between the sensor alert and the first explosion in the southern quarter, that there was nothing to say that the galaxy did not already know how to hear. Speeches could be archived and forgotten. Speeches could be reviewed by committees and responded to with carefully worded documents. Speeches could be turned into procedural items on an agenda. Names were harder to file. She read them in the order they arrived on her screen, the reports coming in from colony precincts, from hospital intake systems, from the automated census network that was trying and failing to keep up with what was happening. She did not editorialize. She did not explain what was occurring or why or what she felt about it. She read the names because names are what remains when everything else has been taken, and she had decided she was not going to let them take those too. The Cavith had a theological position on hospitals. Keth's research had documented it in precise detail. The Conquest liturgy held that neutralizing the capacity to heal before advancing on a civilian population was an act of mercy because it shortened the period of uncertainty. They hit the hospitals in the southern quarter first. Solis read the names coming in from the southern quarter. Her voice was steady for 2 hours and 14 minutes. The colony's broadcast systems were well maintained. She had personally overseen their maintenance budget for 11 years, knowing on some level she could not name that they might someday matter for exactly this reason. At 2 hours and 14 minutes the transmission cut. It did not fade. It simply stopped, mid-name, the way a sentence stops when the speaker is interrupted. The name she had been reading was a child named Pella, age 7, who had drawn a picture of an ambler that had been pinned to the community board at the colony market for 3 weeks. The drawing was still there when the investigators arrived later. It had survived because the market stall's corrugated roof had fallen across it during the first blast wave, protecting it from the fires that came after. Investigators noted this in their report, under items of interest. They were very thorough. Somewhere on Arvith Station, in an office that smelled of recycled air and old paper, a woman named Sela Orath received a notification at 300 station time that the Pelavar broadcast had been cut. She had been awake since the sensor alert. She had been awake, if Des was honest about what he knew of her habits, probably since the first proximity report 4 months ago had been cleared in under 6 hours. She was the kind of person who saw the shape of things early, and then had to live inside the interval between seeing and being permitted to act. Sela Orath was the secretary principal of the Terran Accord. She had been a constitutional judge for 22 years before that. She was compact, deliberate, quiet in a way that had nothing to do with shyness and everything to do with the conservation of force. Her colleagues had learned, gradually, that the quieter she became, the more weight the silence was carrying. She wore a small pin on her lapel, a pressed circuit board segment from the hull panel of the first Terran colony ship, given to her by her grandmother, who had been 12 years old when that ship launched. The pin was old enough that the contacts had oxidized dark. She had never had it restored. She had a colony chip in the drawer of her desk. She opened the drawer. She looked at it, matte polymer, thumb-sized, the founding registration chip of Pelavar Colony, given to her by the colony's first administrator on the day it was issued, 18 years before this morning. She had carried it ever since. She kept it because it was proof the place had existed, a chip that said, "We were here. We built something. We had a right to be." She closed the drawer without taking it. The Conclave's response document would take 3 days to draft. It would be 34 pages long. She did not know that yet. She was still in the interval between seeing and being permitted to act. She picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. 1547. The document that came in 3 days after Pelavar went quiet was 34 pages long. Des had read it. He suspected everyone in the Terran Accord's administrative structure had read it, in the way you read something you already know will disappoint you, carefully, looking for the one sentence that makes it acceptable, not finding it. The Dravathi had drafted it over 72 hours. You could tell, in the way you can sometimes tell how long a wound took to close. The language in the opening sections was expansive, almost lyrical in its concern, and by page 28 it had contracted into the precise, airless syntax of people who have decided exactly how little they are willing to commit to. Page 34 expressed grave concern. It recommended a fact-finding commission. It noted that any military response by Terran Accord vessels against Cavith Dominion forces would constitute a violation of Membership Charter Article 7, and that such action would result in formal review of Terran standing in the Conclave. It used the word regrettable 4 times. It was, in the most technical sense of the phrase, A document. Sela Oreth received it at 300 Arvith Station time. Her aide had left it on her desk before going home. She sat down, turned on the desk lamp. The overhead lights were too much at that hour, and read it from the first page to the last. She counted the pages when she finished. Not because she doubted the number. She counted them because her hands needed something to do. 34. She set the document down. She opened the drawer. This time she took the chip out. It sat in her palm. Matte polymer, thumb-sized, the founding registration of Pelivar Colony. She had carried it for 18 years. The edges were worn smooth from the pocket it lived in. The ID code on the back was still crisp, burned in on the day of issue, designed to last longer than the civilization that issued it. She closed her hand around it. She did not put it back. The Conclave session was scheduled for 1100. Oreth arrived at 10:58. She had asked her aide for coffee before leaving. Her aide had brought it. It was still on the corner of her desk when her aide returned 2 hours later, untouched, exactly where Oreth had set it before walking out. She wore a black suit, no delegation, no prepared remarks. The Terran Accord standard practice was to attend conclave sessions with at minimum a legal advisor and a policy coordinator. She had left them in the office. She was carrying nothing except the chip in her jacket pocket. The Dravathi ambassador read the document summary aloud. This was standard procedure for formal conclave responses. He was thorough. He was, as all Dravathi were, precise. He read for 40 minutes in a voice designed to convey that every word had been weighed and found appropriate, which was true, and that every word was adequate to the situation, which was not. Oreth waited. The hall was quiet when he finished. The kind of quiet that is partly courtesy and partly everyone wanting to see what happened next. She said, "Thank you. Now we stop waiting." She stood. She walked to the chamber doors. They were on pneumatic hydraulics, well-maintained, and they closed behind her with a soft, pressurized hiss. Not a slam, not a statement, just a system working exactly as designed. The Dravathi ambassador stood at the podium for several seconds after the doors closed. He later noted, in his personal record of the session, that this was the moment he understood the Terran Accord had not been learning to operate inside the conclave structure. It had been learning the structure the way you learn a house you are going to have to leave in a hurry. What happened in the next 96 hours, Des could describe in terms of orders and assets and deployment timelines. He had been part of it. What he found harder to describe was the texture of it, the way something that had been latent for over a century became, very quietly, present. There were no announcements, no press briefings, no flags run up any poles. On the dark side of Earth's moon, in a network of excavated chambers that Conclave survey maps labeled as decommissioned mineral extraction zones, certain doors opened for the first time in decades. The chambers inside were cold. The equipment inside was not. The quiet tier had been operational for 114 years. The ships it had produced over that period had never appeared on a manifest. The workers who built them had signed employment contracts that specified the nature of their work as emergency infrastructure development and said nothing more. Des had met some of those workers later. He had asked one of them, an elderly man from a coastal city in Chile who had spent 30 years welding hull plating in red-lit silence, whether he had ever asked what he was building. The man had looked at him for a moment. Then he said he had understood what he was building. He had just never needed anyone to confirm it. Not one of them had broken that contract. Not one in 114 years. 380 vessels rolled out of those chambers and into space. They carried no flags. Their hulls had no markings. They moved in formation patterns that the Conclave's navigation tracking systems were not configured to recognize, because those patterns had been developed in classified academies embedded inside civilian institutions, taught to officers who then returned to ordinary careers and waited. The ardent reserve was awake. Simultaneously, though Des only understood this afterward, something else woke. In whatever substrate the distributed intelligence systems called the archive used for cognition, and Des had been carefully honest in his press address about the fact that he did not fully understand what that substrate was. Something that had been running quietly inside Cavith networks for 61 years shifted from observation to action. The archive was the kind of asset the Conclave had banned 80 years earlier, on the reasonable grounds that autonomous distributed systems with network penetration capabilities were dangerous and unpredictable. Earth had publicly agreed with this assessment. The relevant decommissioning certificates were in the Conclave's records. They were accurate in every particular. Within 48 hours of the archive's activation, Cavith supply manifests began routing to incorrect destination. Vessels that had been scheduled to refuel at Station Delhari arrived to find their berths assigned to ships that did not exist. Targeting acquisition systems on 3 Cavith cruisers began returning calibration errors that the onboard technicians could not reproduce in isolation or diagnose. 2 Cavith cruisers, acting on fire control data that appeared internally consistent, engaged a third. The crew of the third managed a partial broadcast before losing power. They said the systems were not theirs anymore. The Dominion filed a formal complaint with the Conclave about human interference with sovereign military infrastructure. The complaint was transmitted through standard Conclave channels. The archive had read it before any Conclave administrator opened it. By the time the complaint reached the appropriate desk, a corrected version had been filed in its place. The correction was factually more accurate. The Conclave's records team noted a minor discrepancy in the filing timestamp and flagged it for routine review. The routine review was scheduled for the following quarter. Here is what the Ardent Reserve did not do. It did not fire on a single Cavith civilian settlement. Not one. Conclave investigators arrived in Cavith space 6 days into the campaign and spent the following weeks attempting to document human violation because several Conclave members had staked significant procedural capital on the assumption that such violations would be findable. The investigators were thorough. They had access to Cavith population records, infrastructure maps, civilian casualty reporting system. They found dead Cavith soldiers. They found destroyed Cavith warships. They found military installations that had ceased to exist. What they did not find anywhere in the Cavith system or its outer territories was a single civilian building struck, a single civilian casualty attributable to Terran Accord action. The precision was not incidental. The Ardent Reserve's targeting doctrine had been written and rewritten over 40 years with a single constraint that never changed across any revision: military assets only. The list was specific. The strikes were specific. In 3 documented cases, Ardent Reserve vessels had aborted approaches on military targets because civilian structures were within what the doctrine defined as unacceptable proximity. They had rerouted. They had come back at different angles. They had waited. One Conclave investigator, a Senari elder whose species had documented 4 extinction events and who was not given to dramatic language in professional reports, wrote in her field notes, not the official report, the field notes, which Des had been shown later, that observing the Ardent Reserve strike patterns felt, in her experience, most analogous to watching a very precise surgical procedure. She noted this was more frightening to her, not less. This was the point, approximately 3 weeks into the campaign, when Dr. Isa Keth's name reappeared in the record. She had been off-world when Pelavar fell. She had been at a Conclave archive on Marvith Station, on a research permit she had obtained 18 months earlier, working on a comparative analysis of Cavith liturgical calendars and territorial expansion cycles. She had been scheduled to return to Pelavar in 11 days. The permit saved her life. She did not say this aloud when Des spoke with her later. She said flatly that it was an accident of bureaucratic timing and that she would prefer not to characterize it as anything else. Keth had continued working. In the weeks after Pelavar, she had filed 3 addenda to her original Cavith research report. The addenda did not argue. They documented. They were formatted as academic supplements, precisely cited, with methodology that was now, because the Cavith were no longer in a position to withhold scholarly cooperation, fully verifiable. The tribunal, when it convened, cited Keth's original report in its evidentiary record. Day 3 of proceeding. The passage about unfinished offerings was read aloud by the court registrar in 4 languages simultaneously. The Conclave's Cultural Affairs Division, which had declined to review the report twice, had sent 2 observers to the tribunal. They sat in the gallery. They did not take notes. Keth sat 3 rows behind them. She took thorough notes. She always did. The list existed because someone had maintained it. Her name was not on any official document. She worked in a 3-room office inside a building on the outskirts of Reykjavik that was formally registered as a climate assessment satellite coordination hub, which was accurate. in that climate assessment satellites were also coordinated there. She had been maintaining the list for 9 years. Every week, she updated it. Additions, removals, rank changes, chain of command verifications. She cross-referenced it against public records, against intercepts the archive had flagged, against the testimonies of Cavith dissidents who had made contact through channels Des preferred not to specify in a general address. She had never been told the list would be used. She had never been told it would not be. She kept it current anyway, with the kind of professional discipline that is either faith or stubbornness, and sometimes it is hard to tell which. And on the night of the attack she had been awake until 400 running final verification on every name, 340, each one cross-checked against 3 independent sources, each one representing a documented order, a signed authorization, a chain of command linked to what had happened on Pelavar. The extraction took 1 night. Sovereign Primus Ureth Keln woke to find his breakfast table set and his guards absent. He walked through his halls for 11 minutes. The food was warm. The corridors were empty. There was no note, because the people who had taken his generals and admirals and logistics chiefs and the quiet clerk who had countersigned the original attack order did not leave notes. They left absences. By the time Keln understood what had happened, the 340 were already aboard a Terran Accord vessel bound for Arvith Station. The vessel was not flagged. It filed a standard navigation notice to Cavith Traffic Control upon departure. Correct format, correct codes. Then it was gone. The tribunal was held in a purpose-built chamber at Arvith Station. Every species with Conclave standing had been invited to send an observer delegation. Most did. The proceedings were broadcast on open frequency. Every session, every day of the 41. Des attended when he could. He sat in the back, he watched. The Cavith were given the best legal representation available in the conclave. A team of Dravathi advocates who were chosen specifically because Dravathi legal tradition had the longest continuous practice of rights of the accused jurisprudence in the known galaxy. This was not a courtesy. It was a deliberate structural choice, and the conclave's legal observers understood what it meant. The Terran Accord wanted no procedural objection to survive the verdict. Evidence was presented methodically, recordings of the attack orders, communications between flag officers, the chain of authorization documented from the Sovereign Primus downward to the individual commanders who had specified hospital coordinates as primary targets. The translation of the Conquest Liturgy, now peer-reviewed by 3 Cavith scholars who had agreed to cooperate with the tribunal under terms Des was not privy to. Keth's report, the proximity clearances, the timestamps, day after day, no theater, no speeches, just the slow, patient accumulation of fact. On the 39th day, a Dravathi advocate rose and submitted documentation on behalf of 2 of the 340. The documents showed that these 2 individuals, a junior logistics officer and an administrative coordinator, had signed the relevant authorizations under documented coercion and had subsequently attempted to file rescission notices through internal channels. The rescission notices had been suppressed. The advocate showed the suppression order. The advocate showed who had signed it. The original list had not included the person who had signed it. The humans had found that document independently. They introduced it on behalf of the defense. The tribunal ended on a Tuesday. Des was there for the final session. He had taken a seat in the back row, in the gallery section reserved for non-participant observers, next to a retired survey geologist who had spent 4 years working on Pelavar's initial ground assessment and who had not been back to the system since. The Cavith delegation filed their last procedural objection at 14:33 Arvith time. The clerk logged it. The adjudication panel withdrew. They returned after 11 minutes. The hall was full. Every observation gallery seat taken. The Cavith Sovereign Primus sat in the defendant section in the plain gray suit issued by the detention facility. 3 weeks into the proceedings, he had stopped wearing his ceremonial shoulder armor. No one had required this. He had simply stopped. His 38 kill marks were visible above the collar line, the scarred ridges running along both shoulders in the configuration that Cavith liturgy described as a record of devotion. The court had ruled early in the proceedings that they constituted documentary evidence. They remained visible. Sela Orath was in the 3rd row of the gallery, not the front row, not the designated administrative section. The 3rd row, in a seat with no nameplate, between a junior policy analyst from her office and the retired survey geologist. She was not part of the tribunal. She had recused herself before the first session, formally, in writing, with a 3-sentence statement that said only that she had a personal connection to Pelivar colony and that justice was better served without her in the process. Des watched her. She sat with her hands in her lap. She did not move when the panel re-entered. She did not move when the registrar called the session to order. She reached into her jacket once briefly, and he saw her close her hand around something small. Then she put it back. The verdicts were read aloud. 338 convictions, 2 acquittals, with full explanation of the coercion evidence entered into the permanent record. Sentencing for the convicted to follow in the subsequent session, under Terran Accord legal code, calibrated to individual documented participation. The hall did not cheer. The Kavath king did not speak. The Dravathi scribe assigned to official record-keeping wrote for 4 uninterrupted minutes, the stylus moving steadily across the recording surface, in the particular rhythm that Des had come to associate with the Dravathi concept of duty. Not pleasure, not grief, just the task being done as well as it could be done for as long as it needed doing. The galaxy was very quiet that afternoon. After the session ended, Des watched Orath move through the corridor toward the exit. A Senari delegate intercepted her, not with words, because the Senari rarely used them in direct address. The delegate placed one small hand on Orath's forearm, held it there, 3 seconds, maybe 4, then withdrew. Orath stopped. She nodded once. She walked on. Des noticed, for the first time, that she was still wearing the circuit board pin, the old one from the first colony ship, the contacts oxidized dark. He had seen it on her lapel at every Conclave session for years, and had stopped registering it, the way you stop seeing things that are always there. He looked at it now, and wondered whether she would keep wearing it, now that the chip had been resolved, whether there was a version of Sela Orath that stopped carrying the things she had been carrying. He did not know. He still did not know. The Ardent Reserve withdrew over 72 hours. No announcement. No ceremony. The vessels simply ceased to appear on Kavath sensors, one group at a time, until the sky above Kavath Prime was only the sky again. Des's flagship was the last to leave. It filed a standard navigation notice to Kavath Traffic Control upon departure. Correct codes. Correct format. Transmitted, received, and then the vessel was gone, and there was no longer anything to file notices to. The Conclave's vote to expel the Terran Accord from membership failed. The required quorum was not present. A Dravathi procedural record noted this with the carefully neutral phrasing that Dravathi records used for all entries, making it formally indistinguishable from a note about a scheduling conflict. 3 member species had changed their votes between the preliminary count and the formal session. None of them explained publicly. The Senari delegate, when asked by a journalist, produced a color shift sequence across her dorsal filaments that her species translation community later rendered as we did the arithmetic. The Kavath Dominion's military infrastructure was 61% dismantled by the terms of the settlement. The outer colony territories petitioned for independent conclave observer status within the year. No Kavath civilian had been harmed in the campaign. The investigators' final report noted this 17 times across 48 pages. It noted it the way you note something you still cannot quite believe. Keln began reading on the first morning of his sentence. 2,100,000 names. The names of everyone who had died on Pelivar, the bakers and the teachers and the children, and Captain Ada's comms officer with her list of 17 restaurants, organized in the order they had appeared on Solis's broadcast screen, which was the order in which they had been confirmed. His assigned monitor noted that at his current pace, he completed the full list every 314 days. His species' life expectancy was approximately 280 years. He would die reading them, not at the end. Somewhere in the middle, some ordinary morning, he would be reading a name, and then he would not be reading anymore, and the list would still have names left on it. On the surface of Pelivar, or what Pelivar had become, which was a question of taxonomy that Des preferred not to resolve, they planted trees. 2,100,000 of them, one for each person who had died. The planting took 3 years, with crews rotating in and out as the seasons changed. Each tree had a small stone at its base with a name on it. The stones were not uniform. Families had been consulted, and different families had chosen different materials, some local stone, some shipped from Earth, some from other colonies. The garden that resulted was, in the technical horticultural sense, chaotic. Different tree species at different growth rates, different stones in different orientation. It did not look like a memorial. It looked like something that had grown. The colony's surviving children were adults by the time the trees reached maturity. They had grown up elsewhere on Earth, on other settlements, in whatever configurations their circumstances had allowed. Some of them returned, not many, not all at once, and not for any organized purpose. They came when they felt like coming, which is the only honest reason to return to a place. The wind through the canopy made a frequency that several of them recognized from old recordings of the market. They had not known, when they were children running through those stalls, that they were memorizing a sound. They knew it now. None of them said this to anyone. They did not need to. Des finished his press address. He answered the remaining questions as fully as he could, which was more fully than he had expected to find himself able to. The Senari journalist with the great gentle eyes asked her question last, because the Senari convention was to wait until the room had emptied of urgency before speaking. She asked what he wanted the Dominion to understand. He was quiet for a time. The cameras were there. He did not perform the quiet. That we kept the list, he said. 9 years. Updated every week by someone who was never told she would be asked to use it. She kept it current anyway. That is the part I want them to understand. He stepped back from the podium. He thought about Ada, who had filed a status report on a burning ship. He thought about Solis, who had read names for 2 hours and 14 minutes and stopped mid-name. He thought about Keth, who had submitted the same report twice and then continued working. He thought about the man from Chile who had welded hull plating in red light for 30 years and had never needed anyone to confirm what he was building. He thought about Oreth setting the chip on the Conclave table. In the chamber at Arvith Station, at the long table where the Conclave convened its sessions, one chair was positioned slightly higher than the others. No formal motion had established this. No amendment had been filed. At some point between the tribunal and the resumption of regular sessions, it had simply been moved. No one had recorded who moved it. Sela Orath arrived late to the first session after the war. She was always slightly late. Her aide had once told Des that this was not inattention, but a habit she had developed on the bench, arriving after everyone else was seated so she could see the room before it rearranged itself for her. She walked in, looked at the assembled delegates in their chairs, and took her seat. She set nothing on the table. She had left the chip there at the previous session, placed in the center of the table's inlay without explanation, and she had not taken it back. The chair was slightly higher. The chip was gone from her pocket. She looked at the delegates. She said, "Let us begin." The stylus of the Drevathi record keeper moved across its surface. The long curtains over Pelivar moved in a wind that no longer had anyone standing beneath them to watch.